I'm going to start by reading from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 19, and I'm going to read verses 41 to 44. And when Jesus drew near and saw Jerusalem, he wept over it, saying, "Would that you, even you, had known on this day the things that make for peace. But now they are hidden from your eyes, for the days will come upon you when your enemies will set up a barricade around you, and surround you and hem you in on every side, and tear you down to the ground, you and your children within you. And they will not leave one stone upon another in you, because you did not know the time of your visitation." There are a number of ways in which we lash out at one another. The most obvious one of these is through violence, whether that's physical or verbal. But we can also lash out through calculated manipulation, or indeed through passive aggression in a way. I guess the most common way of lashing out, however, is to lash out against ourselves. Bitter self-recrimination or the activation of chronic guilt. These are ways in which we turn our anger that really is directed towards others, or ought to be directed towards others. We turn it inwards and we direct it towards ourselves. But although lashing out takes a number of forms, there's usually only one reason really why we lash out at others or indeed ourselves, and that's because of anger. And I want to be more specific here, I suppose, and say that we lash out at others and ourselves because of poorly managed anger. Now, anger is not a bad thing. It's an important driver to bring about change in what is a very imperfect world. When we or others are being treated unfairly, then it's entirely appropriate for us to be angry about it. But the real issue here, the real vital question, is what we do with that anger, how we express that anger. Now, in this story that we've just read, Jesus has just arrived in Jerusalem. It's the last week of his life. On the coming Friday, he is going to be crucified. Despite the promising start of the entry into Jerusalem and all the palm branch waving and the Hosanna shouting of that event, Jesus knows that in a very few days this city will turn against him and demand his execution. And his response to this is to weep, not for himself, but for those who will reject him. You see, he sees where this will end. He sees where Jerusalem's rejection of him is going to lead. The Jews at this time were under the oppressive rule of the Roman Empire, and they had been for nearly 100 years. And it was just a matter of time before they lashed out against this oppression and rebelled against the Roman Empire. And when this happened, then there would be only one outcome: defeat for the Jews and complete and utter destruction of Jerusalem. But the tricky question for us that we need to answer is, what's the connection between these two things? Jesus is saying that because he is being rejected, then Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. But how does the one lead to the other? Now, let's be clear about this. He's not saying that if the people of Jerusalem had only become followers of him, then they wouldn't care about the injustices of the Roman occupation. Christianity isn't a faith that dismisses any kind of abuse, whether that's political, social, spiritual, whatever, any abuse. Christianity is to be powerfully opposed to it, and certainly Jesus was himself. We see this in his life. You can't read the story of Jesus' life without coming to the clear conclusion that he was concerned about oppression, that he was passionate about justice and freedom. But the thing is, the way he goes about achieving justice and freedom is completely different from how others go about trying to achieve justice and freedom. And this is the point. Jesus' way of responding to the anger that injustice rightly provokes in us is very different from anything that the world had seen up till then. Later on that week, during Jesus' trial, he says to Pontius Pilate at one point, "My kingdom is not of this world." And he's making the same point there. He's saying that his kingdom operates on different principles from the kingdoms of this world. Its purposes and its priorities aren't achieved through violence and warfare. And I think the Apostle Paul can be helpful to us in making sense of the difference here between Jesus' approach and what is normal. In 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 3 to 5, he writes this: "For though we walk in the flesh, we are not waging war against the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but have divine power to destroy strongholds. We destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God, and take every thought captive to obey Christ." Now, whatever the Apostle Paul writes is never very clear, is it? So let me try to explain a little bit of what he's saying here. What he's saying is that as followers of Jesus, we don't fight against wrongdoing and injustice using conventional weapons, what he calls according to the flesh. We do not use the weapons of the flesh. But rather we fight with a message. The message about Jesus. The message that changes our lives so that they resemble the life that Jesus lived. As Paul says, we destroy arguments, every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God. That's the message. And take every thought captive to obey Christ. It's a message that produces a certain kind of life. And this really captures what underlies Jesus' words in the story that we're looking at. And it helps us understand actually why it's breaking his heart as well. He could see how things were going in Jerusalem. He could see that people were angry, rightly angry, at the injustice and the oppression of the Roman Empire. But he could also see that they were going to lash out. And he could see that the inevitable conclusion of this lashing out, this armed uprising that was coming, would be the complete and utter destruction of Jerusalem itself. If only they had recognized that he is the Messiah, if only they had followed him, choosing to bring about change in the same way that he did, not with violence, but with a powerful message and a powerful life, then none of this bloodshed would happen, and Jerusalem would have had a secure future. And Jesus' methods of managing anger are so clearly better than anything else on offer. Now take a look at his example. He lived a peaceful life. He certainly didn't shy away from speaking uncomfortable truth to power. But his method was to preach, and to preach a God of love and mercy, a God who was working in this world through him to transform it. And he backed this preaching up with a life to match. His message and his life proved to be so difficult for the people of his day to handle that they violently lashed out against him and killed him. But in spite of that, he still changed the world. Look also at the example of others who have changed the world by similar methods. Some of them, like Martin Luther King and Mother Teresa, were followers of Jesus. Others, like Gandhi, followed a different path, but on this matter and others, his path and that of the followers of Jesus overlapped. Jesus is showing us a better way. There's no doubt about it. Change is needed. Not because everything is terrible and everything is wicked. Of course it isn't. To say that would be just to talk nonsense. There is so much that is brilliant about our society, so much justice, so much fairness, so much to take pride in. But nevertheless, change is still needed in our workplaces, in our homes, in our churches, in our neighborhood, and in wider society. There are things in all of these theatres in which our lives are acted out that justly make us angry. There is injustice. There is unfairness. Well, if you see that, And if it makes you angry, then hold on to that anger. Don't suppress it. Don't deny it. Don't turn it inwards. Hold on to it. Of course, that anger needs to be tested and to see if it's genuine. And if that anger is, after being tested, proven to be legitimate, then listen to it. Let that anger be the energy that fuels your telling the message of Jesus, this peaceful revolutionary whose life and message so threatened those who were behind the injustices of his day that they killed him. This man of peace who lived and died to change this peace-deprived world. But let that anger not only fuel your telling of this message about Jesus, let it also energize a life that's lived in harmony with the message that you tell. You see, this message, when it's deployed in our words and our actions at the same time, it is the most powerful weapon that exists.